Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. We've been doing these programs during the lockdown to try to help people through what are clearly unprecedented and difficult times. Trying to understand the, as it were, medical, legal, economic implications of COVID-19 for our country and how we're going to actually get through them and what the implications are as we move out of COVID-19. And it's a sheer delight today to welcome Professor Raymond Suttner to talk to me. Raymond Suttner, academic, activist, author, a man with a hugely distinguished career, and I should also add, my memory says, was actually in solitary confinement during the apartheid era for longer than anybody else. So a man who really, and was in prison, a man who really sacrificed so much for the development of a democratic South Africa. Raymond, thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. Can I ask you, you wrote a piece recently, which you sent me, and what I wanted to ask you about that piece was you were very perceptively and bravely talking about the difficulties we're in constitutionally and legally. I wonder if you could just broadly, for people who haven't read the article, I recommend it strongly. Is it being published in the Daily Maverick, or where is it being published? Just if I could give people a heads up.
That's one I sent you the other day. Yes, it's in the Daily Maverick today and yesterday.
Okay, great.
Really...
Could you just summarize very briefly what you said there?
What I was arguing is that there's widespread outrage towards the ANC and the ANC-led government because of allegations or evidence of stealing or fraudulent activities in relation to supplies of materials to combat COVID-19. And I think, as the Daily Maverick said in an editorial, to steal from the people is bad, but to steal from them in a pandemic is a crime against humanity. And I think very many people, I think the way in which people rallied behind the lockdown indicated a sort of patriotism in a good sense, that people wanted to rally behind the government's efforts to combat the lockdown. And they feel a sense of betrayal insofar as many leaders may be implicated in the steal. And what I also found was problematic is the spokesperson to express the outrage of the ANC over corruption is Ace Magashule, a man who is himself fingered in many ways. So it's not exactly a good public relations exercise to have that person as the face of anti-corruption. But I also, yeah.
Carry on.
Sorry. But I raised this in the context of what is the future of the ANC and what is the future of the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa, in the sense that they're often referred to two centers of power. But the problem that I see is that Cyril Ramaphosa is the president of the ANC, but he doesn't control ANC headquarters. And consequently, a lot of the time you have Ace Magashule and a number of Zuma acolytes contradicting Ramaphosa and others. And it's a one-sided fight. Ramaphosa is not fighting back. And I believe in these things, you actually have to assert your authority, whether in a hierarchical sense, not necessarily democratic in the first place. You just have to say who is in charge. And Thabo Mbeki used to go into the ANC offices every Monday, if I'm not mistaken. And that was part of representing not just the state, but also the ANC leadership.
So where we are at present, if I could just take you back a moment.
Yes.
It's not the first thing I ever read of yours, because the first thing I ever read of yours was an article you wrote in Acta Juridicum many, many years ago. But when you came out of prison, you and Jeremy Cronin published a very widely read book, wonderfully illustrated book on the Freedom Charter. And in a sense, were partly responsible, frankly, for bringing the Freedom Charter back into life, part of the movement, UDF, ANC, bring it back to life. When you look at that and you look back on that, are you now surprised that we've really not vindicated the promises of the Freedom Charter as you might have expected when you and Jeremy wrote that all those years ago?
You know, the Freedom Charter is not like a box that you tick, because at a constitution, we have a constitution that in some ways goes further than the Freedom Charter, in the sense that the Freedom Charter was not a constitutional document. So on some levels, the Freedom Charter has been realized. And I've come to believe that the notion of democracy that we had in mind when we wrote that book was not as developed as it became after the 1980s popular power period, which influenced me a lot and made me believe that the clause saying the people shall govern needs to mean not periodic voting only, but also active self-empowerment in a number of local spheres. And that's also part of the problem of the present, that when people see what's happening in the country at the moment, they say vote them out. But in fact, in my view, there is not an electoral alternative to the ANC that will do much better. And the answer to the question is a more long-term thing, which is to build the popular. And we have examples of the popular in a number of countries in the world, but it's mainly in the context of protest. And I think that what was significant about the 1980s is that it wasn't only protest. It was that they drove the authorities out of various townships and they took control of various affairs in those communities through street committees, through systems of popular justice, not necessarily courts. Courts, I think, was not necessarily a goal. But that was a period where they went beyond protest and ungovernability. Ungovernability was not sustainable in the long run, needed to be something more constructive like popular power.
So in the article that you've now penned, after your critique of the present, I mean, you do, I think, work on the assumption that there's no other political alternative that is likely to win an election and be better. But you talk about precisely a richer, a deeper sense of democracy which should emerge in South Africa. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Well, we are seeing it in an organization like Abahlali Basim Jondolo, the Sheikh Dwellers movement, which has about 70 to 80,000 members in KZN. It's got members in Pondoland and in the Western Cape. It's not a national movement, or it is national in its intention, but its power is mainly in KZN. And they've got very democratic procedures. They're very anti-patriarchal, anti-xenophobic, and a number of, they act in a number of ways which I think constitute a reproach on what the government is doing today, the xenophobic actions, the formalistic attitude to non-sexism and things like that. You also have equal education, which is both a popular movement and it may also be considered an NGO, I'm not sure, but it has a very significant popular presence throughout the country as a sectoral organization, not as a national political organization. We have a number of others which I can't remember offhand now, but you don't have a lot of, because there are evictions, because there's failure to provide basic norms in the schools, the way in which many movements appear on the scene is as protest movements or in litigation. Now, litigation is not popular power. Litigation is where you cede your power to a lawyer to do this and the other on your behalf. You do achieve victories for the people, but that's not what I'm having in mind. I'm having in mind multiple abakhlalis and equal educations in the country.
Let me ask you about that, if I could press you a little. One mustn't run the danger of thinking everything that was done during the 80s under the UDF period was wonderful. I mean, there were some very important parts,
Yes.
no question. So I don't want to go into that. That's for another occasion. But it did strike just two aspects, one of which you've mentioned already, and the other I'd like to mention. The one that you've mentioned was the question of when you steal, whoever you are, precious resources in a COVID-19 pandemic, when we know from all the research that there are millions of our fellow South Africans who are starving. I mean, the level of outrage which you articulated in your article is one that one would hope, and I think is beginning to take hold in South Africa at large. But it struck me, if I could take a second example, when Collins Khoza was murdered by security forces, at least allegedly, I think more than just allegedly. I mean, it's extraordinary to contrast that to the George Floyd situation in the United States, where people, both black and white, came onto the streets and said, enough's enough, this is outrageous. And we seem to be so tepid in our response to a similar situation in South Africa. And I wondered, why? Why is it that we've not got that? I mean, you're talking about interesting and important organizations, but why is it that we've been so reluctant, as it were, or why is it that there hasn't been the sort of activism that one would have expected in the light of this, in the light of the outrage that you expressed, or I'm sure the outrage that both of us felt when we read about Collins Khoza?
Well, you see, I think it's fragmented. In the first week of the first 10 days or so of the lockdown, more people died from a security force action than from COVID-19. And it's fragmented in that it happens in one part of the country and there may not be an organized force there, and you've got the police and the SANDF marching there. I think there are two problems. The one is that the ANC has changed. There would have been a time when the ANC leadership would have ensured that whoever had done this or had been responsible for seeing that it shouldn't have been done was brought to book. Now that has not happened, in that the ministers of police and defense have not been hauled over the coals. The minister, the SANDF had a sort of whitewash over Collins Khoza. The Minister of Police is completely undefensive about police forcing people to do demeaning exercises. Someone commented on people being frog marched. He says, no one has been frog marched from their home. If they were in their home, they wouldn't be frog marched.
So, in the light, Raymond, of where we, are at the present, you mentioned litigation, and of course you're right that litigation on its own doesn't do everything, maybe doesn't do a lot. But it did strike me, just if I could ask you that, the combination of litigation and activism can be quite devastating, and the Treatment Action Campaign was an example of that. And we haven't really seen that since then.
Yes, now I think it is very important to not fall into the trap of saying that constitutionalism and legal actions are unimportant. That was one of the things I said about the Freedom Charter, is that the Constitution has done what the Freedom Charter couldn't do, because the Freedom Charter wasn't a legal document. And the Constitution was an act of Parliament which has provided openings for assuring legal rights, and where these are not realized, they can be vindicated some of the time in courts. And the combination, as you say, of popular movements and the courts is very important. And you mentioned Treatment Action Campaign, but we also have the situation now where Equal Education, Section 27 and others have brought legal action to ensure that those who are not at school still get the meals that they were getting when schools were opened before COVID-19. So that that legal action would not have happened if school children had just felt hungry. There needed to be an organization, and an organization that was able to act through lawyers. And that combination is found also with the shack dwellers movement. Abaklali, they use Siri, amongst others, to prevent unlawful evictions. So I do agree. I think we've got to use all the weapons at our disposal and defend ourselves and also enrich our freedoms, both by using constitutionalism, but also building organization that can empower people to act on their own behalf, and not only through lawyers, not only through elections.
Do you think, just if I could there are two fundamental implications that come out of this. The first is, you've mentioned some of these organizations, which of course, you're right, are very active and very, very successful. Do you foresee, in the light of where we are, and in the absence, let's say, of political alternatives, so let's leave that off the table, do you foresee, as we move forward, a broader set of movements that is going to sort of take hold of the national imagination in the way in which the 1980s were? Are we at an inflection point politically, in your view?
I don't think that. I think the question really is, in a situation where there's a failure of formal democratic institutions, there is a possibility of popular action, but there's also an action of populist action. And there is a danger in South Africa of that populism being right-wing populism or even fascism. And I think the way in which xenophobia plays itself out has got some fascist inflections. This thing of referring to the overcrowding of health institutions by foreign nationals, by Motsoaledi and amongst others, and this leading to the spread of disease. If you go and look at Hitler, he used similar language about the Jews. They were bearers of disease. So that this is not uncommon in fascism. I'm not saying that just the language that one uses is sufficient to make fascism, but I think we've got a danger of authoritarian populism, as was Trump. In America, in the United States and Brazil, you had a disillusionment with the formal institutions of democracy. In the case of Brazil, it was a left-wing political party that disillusioned many people, and many who had supported the Workers' Party, the PT, actually went and voted for Bolsonaro. And you have this possibility of a reinforced popular movement. But at the moment in South Africa, we don't really have strong popular movement on a broad scale. So the danger, one of the priorities in my view would be to combat the manifestations of authoritarian populism, or even populism generally. I understand populism to mean the use of slogans of the popular without a program for realizing them. And I think this is the case with the EFF to a large extent.
So let me ask you this. You're right. I mean, there's no question. I'd agree with you entirely that there's a tendency towards authoritarianism the world over. In fact, one of the things that we've discussed on the series already with other people, but you've raised it pertinently, when you refer to Brazil and the United States of America, there are all sorts of countries all over the world that have shifted from what was, let's say, an embrace of constitutional democracy. One can take Modi's India or Hungary, Orban's Hungary, Erdogan's Turkey. Well, I mean, the Polish example, even Boris Johnson in the United States, in the United Kingdom, but we surfed that wave of enthusiasm for constitutional democracy. Rightly say, these tendencies are all over now. Given the levels of poverty and given the levels of inequality and given what seemingly seems to be such difficulty in addressing these problems, we had problems before COVID-19, now even more so now. Are you not really worried?
When people are starving, they are not really able to play a powerful political role. And it may create, the only really powerful force at the moment is the government, the state, that is failing to deliver what the hungry people want through bureaucracy, through xenophobia, through general callousness and indifference. But that state remains a powerful force in the way that political organizations are not really able to be. And there is a danger, either through the state or through organizations, that we will see a right-wing populist move, even a fascist move. I'm just wanting to raise fascism, not because I see it happening, because there's a lot of cultural factors which would resist fascism in South Africa. However, we're not immune to it because some of the signs of that possibility are there.
But then let me just push that a little bit. I mentioned, of course, the contribution that you and Jeremy made, well, for many things, but let's leave that aside, but the Freedom Charter book. When you wrote that, and when most of us were marching in the UDF or alternatively working in the trade union movement, etc., we did think that the possibility of a non-racial, non-sexist democracy was attainable. Racialism has been on the back burner for some.
We understand why non-racialism needs to be debated much more than it is, because it's not colorblindness. And
yes.
when I was in the UDF, I was very conscious of the fact that I was a white who, although I was an equal comrade of others, I actually had opportunities that others didn't have. And I had a car. After UDF meetings, I used to drive Paul Mashatile back to Alex. I had a university education. So when I went to meetings, I had to impress people not with my intellectual brilliance or something like that. I had to impress them with the ideas that we were communicating. So I had to learn to communicate those ideas, not to a postgraduate classroom, but to many people who had limited formal education, but who actually understood a lot of things better than I did. Now, when I was involved in the UDF, but also in the early years of the unbanning, I learned a lot of things from listening to people, because there's a lot of things which we understand purely as ideas that we've read in books, but the peasants that you read about in books, you can actually see if you go to these places, or the working class that you read about in socialist texts, they are around. I remember Popo Molefe took me to meet Chris Dlamini, Enoch Godongwana, and others on the East Rand. And I would hear things from these meetings that I only knew from books, and they had an inflection in South Africa that, of course, was distinct. And you needed to listen to that, to pick that up and incorporate that in your understanding of the Freedom Charter, in your understanding of the route to a democratic future. I believe it's very
Raymond, I understand. Yeah. No. What you said is incredibly important. And the fact that non-racialism doesn't mean colorblindness, that it means an awareness of the privileges that people like you and I had by virtue of dint of the color of our skin. Unfortunately, too many people forget that. I'm with you entirely. No, it's not debatable. But it does worry me that the idea of building a South African nation, which was in a sense where the dignity of difference was really central, but essentially that we were going to be a nation as a whole. And somehow we would get by that. I'm just worried that with populism, with inequality, with the fact that class and race so overlay in South Africa, that we're moving away from that model rather than towards that model.
You know, what is important is that building unity has to coexist with recognition respectfully of difference, and not seeing difference as static, frozen, and not seeing unity as static and frozen in time. That there needs to be a dynamic relationship with those things. Someone was sending, I was doing some interview on email, and someone was asking me something about Afrikaners and associating racism. Now, Bram Fischer problematized the notion of being an Afrikaner, showing that the notion of being an Afrikaner could take a number of different forms by the life he led. And I think the same goes with having a number of cultural traits. I mean, being gay, lesbian, trans, and so forth, they're not static concepts. Within those notions of sexualities, you have a number of variants. So what we've got to do is A, recognize the value of unity, B, recognize the value of difference, but not fetishize them in one static form, but see ourselves as continually learning and growing and becoming more than we are at this moment.
So therefore, running out of time as I am, one final question to you. In the light of what you just said, do you have hope that we're going to come out of this, that we're going to kind of move, not in a static way, but in a dynamic way to something better?
You know, hope is like luck. And I think one of these cricketers said, you've got to work for your luck. So you've got to work for your hope. And I'm trying my best I've changed my ideas quite a lot. I learn a lot, and I hope that I can put that into the mix, and that we can come out of this and realize the potential that this country has, which we both love very much.
You know, it's a wonderful way to end, because if everybody took that advice and that we all learned, both from our past and from our present, we could confront the future with in a lot better shape than we are. And in a way, you are a living example of that. And Raymond, thank you very much. It's been an extraordinarily interesting discussion, as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure it'll be a very interesting discussion for everybody to hear. Please carry on with the good work. We're very much in your debt. And thank you. And I'm in your debt for this conversation this morning. Thank you very much.